Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar. This is our third day of action for disability equality in education. We began 2 years ago with a meeting in Parliament and a series of demands that we have been pushing forward for disabled workers and students to be fully integrated. And this year, of course, we're meeting in the shadow of COVID, when many people are face-to-face teaching, when we don't think that is the right thing to be doing in terms of protecting people's health and well-being. So a strange time to meet, and a day when sadly we won't be having so many amazing protests outside of inaccessible buildings and militant actions that we normally have. But we thought that this would be a time to talk about organising disabled workers and disabled students too, where people want to begin to change the experiences and the discrimination that we face. So today on screen, you can see now I have two speakers. I'm afraid that Annie from the TUC is ill and is unable to come, but we have two really brilliant speakers. We have Colleen Johnson from the NEU, who is the disabled members seat holder. She also sits on the TUC Disabled Workers Committee with me, and Colleen has been teaching and is still teaching face-to-face in primary education at the coalface, organising workers. She is an amazing activist around disabled people's equality, who I've known for a while now, and I'm really pleased to have her with us. And then we have Themesa Neckles, who, give us a wave, Themesa, is the Vice Chair of the Disabled Members Committee of the UCU. She would like to say she's quite new to activism. She may be new, but she is an amazing person to have as the Vice Chair of our committee, committed, hardworking, organising reps, just really, really feisty in fighting for disabled workers' rights. So she's going to give us her take, particularly from an intersectional point of view. And I should have introduced myself. I'm Elane Heffernan. I'm Chair of Disabled Members in the UCU, and one of my impairments is to be quite forgetful, so apologies for that. Okay, I'm going to make a few opening remarks, and then we're going to hear from Colleen and then Themesa. Yeah, we're meeting in the shadow of a pandemic that has almost appeared to target disabled people. Although when we think of the death rates, if you're a disabled woman, you are under the age of 65, you are 11 times more likely to die from COVID than if you are not, if you're a non-disabled woman. If you're a disabled man under 65, you're 6.5 times more likely to die. If you are a young person with learning disabilities, as we famously found out recently, you are 30 times more likely to die than another young person of the same age who does not have impairment and who is not disabled. And I wanted to kind of highlight two things, really. I always do when we speak about this, that if 60% of the dead are disabled, but we also know there is a massive disproportion in terms of Black people dying from this disease, then we know that there is an intersection of racism, structural and institutional racism, with structural ableism that leads to these terrible deaths. The way in which the government hadn't prepared and hadn't thought about getting ventilators, the way in which the emergency legislation removed our rights as disabled people in a number of ways that I won't talk about now because of time, but they took away our rights in emergency legislation. They took away the right to integrated education and weakened the rights that students have. It's really, really dreadful. And at the same time as forcing schools to be open, claiming it's about people's mental health, they have at the same time actually ensured that that 1/5 of all students with special educational needs have not been at school anywhere at all during this pandemic. And at no point have they made sure that all of those kids are in some way integrated back from their homes into the classroom, that they have the equipment that they need, that there are the support workers available to work with them. They've simply left 1/5 of all young people with special educational needs to kind of rot on the sidelines at the same time as hypocritically claiming they're keeping these schools open for mental health. It's appalling ableism. They've taken away our rights in terms of the right to, it was never met actually, but on paper we have had a right to independent living and to the support and care needs being met for people to be able to participate in society. That duty has been weakened dramatically in the emergency legislation. And in terms of mental health, and again, a deeply intersectional issue, they have removed the requirement that 2 doctors forcibly commit someone to a mental health care in a mental health hospital down to 1. And as we know already, if you are a Black person in this society, you are far more likely to be given a serious mental health label and considered to need to be incarcerated somewhere. So that's another intersectional attack on disabled and Black people that has taken place. So it's been a really difficult time. I just want to highlight a few things about the workplace. For many disabled workers, this has been an increase again in ableism and oppression. And at the same time, it's been a glimpse, I think, for people who were not disabled before the pandemic. Some have become disabled through long COVID, and that's an issue as unions, and at the TUC we are taking up and thinking about how to organise around. But at the same, it's been a glimpse into our lives in many ways, but it hasn't made us all equal. The health and safety threat in schools and in colleges and universities hasn't brought disabled workers and everyone else to the same level. What it has done, I think, is increased our oppression in many ways. In every aspect of our life, it's more stressful than it was. The supermarket deliveries that many people who were at risk were unable to get and forced to go out. Being in work until March when it wasn't safe for everybody, but particularly for, as we know, with 60% of the dead being people with particular medical conditions, not safe for many disabled people to be there. When they send us home, it didn't solve the problem for very many disabled members because we were sent home without the reasonable adjustment equipment, personal assistance and things we rely on, and told just to get on and do our best to do our work. And all the time under the shadow of knowing that doing the best to do our work might well mean that if we don't get as much done as everybody else, or in fact sometimes more, that when it comes to redundancies, we might be the first to be selected. And we have faced an appalling amount of redundancies within the university sector where employers have taken really just taken advantage of COVID to attempt to restructure and reorganise. And in the middle of the summer, a report came out from the CAB that showed disabled workers were twice as likely to be made redundant as non-disabled workers. And that happens whether it's compulsory redundancies or the tap on the shoulder to volunteer that we are hearing about. I'm hearing about as chair of disabled members all the time where there are redundancies in the department. Maybe you should go, maybe it's too much for you, etc. Where we don't have our adjustments and we don't have a good attitude in our workplace, we're more likely to be made redundant. I'm not going to say very much about mental health now. I am going to stand in for Annie and say a little bit after the other speakers. But I just wanted to say that I think COVID has impacted the mental health of everybody. You see it with young people enormously. I see that in my day job with young people. You see it enormously amongst the whole population, everyone who is isolated in particular, but you see it really amongst people who live in mental distress as opposed to are stressed or impacted. But people who have a level of mental distress that means they are disabled in the law. The isolation can increase because we have a government that doesn't put anything that we need, doesn't put in place anything to support our mental health when they organise lockdowns. We have a situation where workplace stress is enormously increased for all members of our trade unions and all the workers in our workplace, like enormous extra amounts of work in this hybrid model of online, not online, face-to-face teaching, trying to do both things at once in very many cases. So we've seen it really impact people's mental health. So yeah, I think I'll talk later about special reasonable adjustments and how we can begin to organise, but I wanted to start from where disabled and non-disabled workers are in the same situation in terms of a push and an increase in exploitation and an increase in stress and workload and so on. But disabled members are particularly impacted and impacted in ways that it's difficult for people who are not disabled to understand. So a coming together to collectivise and organise is going to be really important for all of us. Right, I've spoken a lot, so I'm going to hand over to Colleen and from our sister union, the NEU, who've always organised and supported these days of action. Very welcome, Colleen, and love to hear how you do it.
Thank you, Elane, and lovely to hear from you as ever. Thank you very much for the invitation today. So I hope you're going to find the information about how the NEU organises disabled workers really interesting to compare. The National Education Union represents teachers and teaching assistants, school office staff, cooks, caretakers and other workers. And whilst I represent disabled workers from all of those different parts of our union, we know that education-related jobs are tough, but we do not accept barriers to disabled people in schools and colleges. The temptation is for members to keep quiet and to keep their heads down in order to avoid conflict and possible harassment. But that only gets you so far. And actually, there's no pride and no self-esteem in that. So our union has adopted the social model of disability, where a person is disabled by the barriers in society, be they physical or attitudinal barriers. This is opposed to the medical model, which defines people by their disability and labels them as broken. And we ask members to self-identify as disabled by updating their membership details online. If they are not sure, we might refer them to the Equality Act to help them to decide. But we make it clear that they self-identify to us, their union, and we don't share that information with their employer. So the aim is ultimately to have active, empowered members who know their rights and who stand together and support each other. We make it clear that we include invisible impairments and therefore, of course, mental health impairments too. We are really careful, we are really careful and positive in the language that we use in relation to disability. We know that there's a problem with the numbers of members self-identifying. To be frank, it's far too low. A figure closer to 20% of total membership would reflect the general UK situation across all sectors. This is where campaigns like our workload campaign helps. A realistic and a doable job is good for everyone, disabled and non-disabled. To help build our group, we created the Disabled Members Organising Forum, with forum members coming from different regions and countries. Our members are voted into post by their region. Organising forum members run events and they run activities for disabled members within their region with the support of the local NEU staff. Periodically, Organising forum members meet up to feedback from their regions and to network. An important part of those meetings is sharing of good practice. Plus, I read a report from my latest actions and plans. Every year, we have a Disabled Members Conference, where usually everyone gets together. That was before COVID, wasn't it? We have speakers, panels and workshops to attend. And most importantly, at our conference, we have the motions debate, where submitted motions from disabled members are considered and voted upon. The most popular motion then goes off to annual NEU conference to see if it will be adopted and form the basis of future NEU policy and practice. A recent disabled members motion secured some disability equality training for district and branch secretaries, a publication welcoming new disabled members, and the opportunity to role share at executive level for disabled members. And it's interesting, we did our NEU Disabled Members Conference this year virtually, and we had a number of meetings over a fairly long time span, and Elane was a brilliant panelist at one of our events. So, let me see. As for me, we're over 70 NEU national executives, and I'm one of 3 equality seat holders. My role covers the whole geographical area of our membership And so there's always plenty to do, visiting districts and running workshops, for example. And mostly my role is to share the views and experiences of disabled members and to promote the message of disability equality. And just like Annie and Elane, I'm a member of the TUC Disabled Workers Committee. And I don't mind telling you, I'm really proud of that. Attending TUC Disabled Workers Conference is a real treat for new NEU disabled members, as listening to disabled people from many different professions is hugely empowering. Coming up to date now, for the last few months have been really tough for everyone, and not least for at-risk and disabled members. Along with a couple of national executive colleagues, I've held many national informal drop-in Zooms to support some very concerned members. Their experiences in school have varied hugely. Some employers have been amazing from the outset, whilst others have been shockingly dismissive or even aggressive. And all of this has played out against a background of school cuts where everything seems to come down to just money. We have always given the same advice. Go to your rep. And if you haven't got a rep, consider being that rep. Request a risk assessment that is created with you and get it regularly reviewed. If necessary, ask for a referral to occupational health. Seek support at district and, if necessary, regional level. Now, most times, but not every time, this worked quite well. And the upper tier of the NEU leadership has tried hard to keep at-risk members and disabled members and the membership in general safe, amidst a background of anti-union legislation and varying public opinion regarding keeping schools open. Of course, there are disabled members who are not at additional risk from COVID. We cannot and should not forget those. Many are struggling as their reasonable adjustments and access rights are compromised by some of the COVID measures. What's missing too often in general, if I'm being honest, is collective action in workplaces around disabled members and disability equality. On the rare occasions that I see it, I know a union group have got it right, that they stand together united on a number of issues of importance to them. Shared values. Now that's real solidarity. We need many more members self-identifying and being active within our union, and for disability equality to be more of a priority in all of our unions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I was kind of joking earlier that we might get through things much quicker as it's an all-women panel today, and I'm the only one that over-talks on this panel. Before I call Themesa in, I just want to apologise if the Wi-Fi has been breaking up for people. I could just sort of understand what Colleen was saying, but it was quite difficult at times with the breakup. There is a question come in, which is asking the sister union, but I think we, Themesa, you can always answer this later as well. So I'm just giving it you now so you know it's coming up. A question has come in asking what strategies are good to avoid using when organising disabled workers. So Colleen's given us some really good positive strategies, but yeah, if you can think of any things that are best avoided, Colleen, people would like to hear about that. Okay, so Themesa is our next speaker. Themesa works at Sheffield. And as I said, she is both an amazing activist and a really great teacher there as well.
Thank you, Elane, and good afternoon all. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about disabled workers organising in this current climate. According to the UN, persons with disabilities are among the hardest hit by COVID-19. Even under normal circumstances, the 1 billion persons with disabilities worldwide are less likely to access healthcare, education, employment, and are more likely to live in poverty and experience abuse. The pandemic further compounds the situation, particularly for disabled workers in the UK who are on lower grades and on casualised contracts. Based on all the evidence Elane has just shared with us, the risk in the response to the current climate is that disabled workers are once again being left behind, and the International Labour Organization suggests that we need to act, interact, and communicate differently because the already established structural inequalities are worsening due to the impact of COVID on our lifestyle, our livelihood, and on our lives. Fundamentally, what we need is social justice, effective inclusion, equality of opportunities, and decent work. And these can only come about by organizing through our unions, organizations, and even within our teaching and office spaces so that we could make a difference and effect varying levels of change within our institutions. The pandemic presents challenges for us as employees because we are operating in a different working environment. But it also presents challenges for our employers because they have a duty to continue to meet their obligations, their legal obligations, to make reasonable adjustments for us in light of the changing and challenging circumstances. We are in a climate where the feeling is that our employers are expecting us to work more than the hours set out in our contract of employment, and for some reason, we feel compelled to do so. Many of us are deemed essential to the success of our institutions and are forced to continue working in unsafe situations and, as Elane stated, without the appropriate reasonable adjustments. It is for these reasons and more that we need to organize and work with our local branches. And this seems like an easy starting point, but quietly talking to a few of our colleagues within our immediate space or online community who we might think are interested in organizing might be even easier. These private discussions of workplace issues can be very helpful for self-organizing. And part of that process is about becoming educated about the ways in which the union can support small groups. So some of the things I could think about when it comes to organizing include getting to know your local branch to increase your visibility so that you could develop a level of trust and build relationships with the people who would be supportive of you. I always think if people don't know you, they are less likely to trust you and to become involved in any campaigns or initiatives that you might have. The other thing is getting involved in or establishing self-organizing groups or networks can be very effective. And it does not mean that as a disabled person, you should be directly involved in a disability group. I would suggest that you use other protected characteristics. So joining the Black Members Committee, the Women Committee, the Digital Network, LBGT+, or even the migrant groups, depending on your particular interests and or protected characteristics, would be one way of being able to organize. The other thing that I would say is enrolling in CPD courses, getting relevant accredited training to become more involved in a formalized way within the committee setting of a union. So for example, becoming the health and safety officer or the EDI officer is one way, again, of helping to organize in these challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you, Themesa. I will be coming back to both of you with just some general questions that we could all chat about, but I want to say something about mental health and organising, particularly around mental health in our workplaces, to begin with. And I guess there's two things, isn't there? One is that we are facing a mental health crisis in society, as I said earlier. It isn't just because there is a pandemic and we can't see and spend as much time socialising as before, but that for some people is very impactful on mental health. Actually, there are some people who find that's very helpful to their mental health because they get to suit themselves and be more distant from family or friendship networks than they were before. So sometimes it can be useful, but for very many people it's difficult. I think when it comes to how we think about mental health, there's been a big push lately, hasn't there? You know, people in the royal family getting involved, celebrities, the kind of we should talk, and we should talk. Talking is very important, I believe. I'm a therapist, I believe, obviously, I get paid to do it. Talking is very important for our mental health. But I also think that approach to mental health, which kind of gives tips about how as individuals we can look after our own mental health, we could exercise, we stay connected to people, we turn our blue light machines off and get a good night's sleep, we think about sleep hygiene, all of those kind of things, the gratitude journals, the meditations, they can be very, very useful for looking after individuals' mental health. But mental health and mental distress is not an individual issue. It is an issue that is, I mean, yes, some people have brain chemistry that leads to certain things, but actually people are generally created in mental distress because of the way that society functions, whether it's on an individual level that people endure trauma and mental distress are very closely connected indeed, particularly in groups of people who have to live through and survive structural, social and economic oppression and inequality. That creates in itself trauma and mental distress. But also we are finding, and people are really beginning to see this, perhaps who weren't aware of it before, that our mental health is enormously impacted by the levels of work stress that people are enduring, the levels of work bullying that are, you know, the UCU has been talking, and I know the NEU's talked about this before as well. You know, the levels of bullying and to get things done, to do more than we can do, to make up for the redundancies. I was in the FE sector before I lost my job due to impairments, actually. But in that sector, you could see the decline of people's mental health from 2010 onwards because of the impossibility of continually making up for the round of redundancy, and the 25% gap in real terms of people's pay. You couldn't even afford to buy in enough stuff for yourself to get home and have your food delivered or something to get you some time. So mental ill health is created by our work. But I want to kind of just say a couple of quick things about it. Beware, I think, first, the approach from many employers who are now paying attention to mental health in general, mental well-being, all of those things that I mentioned earlier, that you're getting emails about positive, affirmative thoughts, all of that stuff that are coming through in the mental well-being from your employers and from their HR. Not that they're not useful, but beware that they are not used in order to start blaming individuals who cannot manage the stress of the modern workplace, of the commodified university, of the face-to-face and online teaching at the same time, of the constant shifting of the COVID in and out of the workplace, face-to-face, not face-to-face, isolating, not isolating. Beware that it isn't used to blame individuals. And also, I want to give you the very useful tips that they don't give you for individual mental health. Take breaks every 45 minutes. Get up or move in your chair. Do whatever you can to physically move yourself, because brain and body like that interaction, and not to be staring at your screen and working without little breaks to make a cup of tea, to just rest your eyes and your mind for a while. They don't often tell you to do that properly. Do not overwork. My main tip on mental health. We have to bring workload issues to the union and we have to collectivise them. We cannot have a situation where individuals are trying to manage. I think Colleen said this before, we can't have a situation where individuals are trying to manage their workload by themselves and protest about it by themselves. We need to collectivise these issues and social model it. I think Colleen gave us a brilliant talk about how the social model works and why if we social model things, everybody has access and it helps us all. So those little bits, I think, but I wanted to talk about people who live with mental distress, who are disabled in terms of the Equality Act definition, that is that it has a substantial impact on their well-being and their ability to live life, and a substantial length of time, a year or more, or could last for a year or more, because we need specific adjustments for that. That cannot be taken care of in this management's small level well-being strategy for all. We need each individual to be able to identify, ask for what they need, and live in a workplace that has an atmosphere where it is normal that people get periods of mental distress in their lives and it doesn't define us. So I actually am a therapist and I also have been a mental health service user in my life. I'm not defined by that. And I can work perfectly well and fit into workplaces where there is a genuine attitude of dignity, of adjustment, of solidarity, really. And of course, the management will never create that. The union has to create those kind of atmospheres by talking about it, by collectivising the struggle for reasonable adjustments in the workplace. I'm not going to say more because I always talk for too long, so sorry. But I think it's really important that we begin to create an atmosphere inside of our workplaces where to be a person who has an impairment, to be a person who lives in mental distress, to be a person in your social model language with disability, not a disabled person, not a person with a disability, but a person whose society has created the barriers to, a person with disability brought to us from without. We need to normalise that situation and we need to make it much more public. The unions have for too long, I think, done casework as an individual question, and this will be my final bit before I call on the others to come back in. But somebody said strategies to avoid. One of them is only using the law. We need the law. The law is very important for disabled people and we have to fight to defend it. And this government are going to attack, I believe, our civil rights. We have to defend the equality law. And it's very important. It often, the fear of a good case often holds management back from doing certain things, but it isn't enough. It isn't enough. I really developed a lot of anxiety and mental unwellness trying to sort out adjustments for a long time. We need to do these things collectively and to make it a battle that the union begins to protest about. If we have somebody fighting an individual case, we do that. But at the same time, there is nothing to stop us in a disconnected way, bringing the question of reasonable adjustments to a union meeting, organising a protest for it, organising a lobby of our management, etc. We need to collectivise these issues. And that will help people's mental health, actually, because there is nothing like living in solidarity that overturns that structural and economic oppression's impact on individuals. So that's enough from me. I don't know if Colleen or Themesa, you would like to say anything about strategies to avoid? If you can, don't worry if you haven't got anything to say on it, but if you have any. Shall I move on to something else? One of the other things that has been coming up, you can come back to that question if you want, whenever you like, but one of the things that has been coming up is the increasing hostility towards disabled people. Anecdotally, I'm hearing a lot about it. There has definitely been some discussion in DPOs, disabled people's organisations, with whom I think it's really important we link up as unions. So I don't know if either of you two would like to say anything about increasing ableism and just how it's going and how to combat it, if you can. Colleen, would you like to go first?
Is that okay now?
Actually, you are.
Does that sound okay now?
You're still breaking up a little bit, actually.
Okay.
Should we go to Themesa and come back to you? I don't know if it would be safe for you to log out and back in to see if it fixes the issue. Don't want to lose you.
Can you hear now?
Yes, that's better. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's possibly my computer just doesn't seem to get on with this platform. I think it's that. Just actually hearing them speak when she was talking about, you know, being active and being, you know, what you might want to do with the union as well as being a rep. Because sometimes I think that is hard. The thing that came to mind with me was being an equality officer. For a lot of people, I think that equality officer in a district is really interesting. And when you were talking, Elane, when you were talking about mental health distress, I was always taught that that was part of being human, and that, you know, most of us at some point in our life would have some periods of mental distress, because we're not robots, we're not machines. And so to me, if you grow up with that kind of sort of approach, that, you know, you should talk to each other, talk about how you're feeling, and you know, you're human, so you should be expected to you know, have human issues every now and again, and it's not a bad thing at all. About increasing ableism, it's interesting, isn't it? That goes right from people being very hostile if they see somebody who hasn't got a mask on, when there might be a very good reason not to be wearing a mask. If a person has a mental health impairment or breathing difficulty, there can be a lot of difficulty. And I think this idea as well, I think this idea whether COVID measures are sort of crossing over some people's adjustment is quite a difficult one. And yes, it is the first time where lots of people actually come across, you know, not being able to leave their house, or, you know, having to play a game by other people's rules. And so I find it an interesting time and a very stressful time, you know, on occasion.
Yeah.
Themesa, sorry, is there anything you want to say around ableism?
Yes, what I wanted to say is that, particularly at a time like this, you find that a number of disabled people continue to struggle, and I guess are worse off because of the situation and circumstances that they're in. But what I find happening is that now that everyone is working online and everyone is struggling and everyone is excessively tired, it's becoming something that we need to look at in terms of people's workloads, in terms of the ways in which people are being given an insurmountable amount of marking to do. You know, so those things are now coming to light as an issue that needs to be dealt with. And what is sad, I feel, is that previously disabled people have been talking about, you know, needing adjustments to enable them to work, needing adjustments in terms of their workloads, you know, asking for adjustments where it comes to working from home. But now this is the norm or the new normal, and it's okay. So again, you see a shift is taking place, but it's being normalized, and that normalization again puts us in another category. You know, when Colleen talks about this being human, you know, what does that actually mean? And are we even human? And if we are, how is that recognized? Why are institutions continuing to be ableist in its structures, ableist in the way in which they talk about us? I have an invisible disability, and people say to me, "You don't look disabled." So why do you need adjustments? Because you've got visual vertigo. What does that actually mean? You know, and I feel like institutions don't take the time to understand who we are and educate themselves about us to help us and support us, you know, and I find that's very frustrating at times, and that's what I wanted to add to the conversation.
Thank you. We have actually just produced an everyday ableism sheet, and on Friday, if you haven't seen enough of us all, Themesa will be, we'll have a slightly different webinar with different participants. Themesa will be chairing, and I'm speaking. We have a really brilliant young student who's part of the Alliance for Inclusive Education, one of our partners in this day of action, taking part as well. And we're going to really talk about ableism, what it is and how to fight it. And I guess the only comment I would add on ableism to what's been said by the other two so far is that we need to educate all of our union reps in it, because I think too often people have thought there's a sort of ableism in the heart of many of our workplaces and even our unions, where too often people think about disabled people as kind of poor unfortunates who are not in the workplace, who are all getting benefits or not getting benefits. Our unions have been very good at supporting and funding the fights for independent living, for disability benefits and so on. But quite often I think people aren't really quite integrated their thinking yet about disabled people being members of their union. And what Themesa said is very important about the kind of questions that we get, the kind of intrusive commentary that we'll get from our managers, and sometimes a lack of understanding in the union. Like, I know that members have sat in meetings being represented where really brilliant union reps have not understood something that has occurred, that is a comment made that is really ableist, that is actually really attacking a disabled person. But you know, we need more education on ableism and how to fight it, I think, in the unions. Colleen, were you waving? Did you have something more to add?
Yes, I mean, I was really, because I was thinking about this thing about diversity. You know, one of the things you mentioned to us a little while ago, Elane, I wrote it down, about how do we develop confidence in people to be active in the likelihood of things like harassment. And just listening to Themesa there, you know, it's and yourself, it's around diversity, isn't it? People are not the same, you know. People are absolutely individuals, and you know, people who are disabled are not broken. You know, you can be born with a disability. You can get a disability through having an accident. A lot of people, as they get older, are going to become, you know, are going to get an impairment. So basically, we need to have this view about lots of things being much more inclusive. And Themesa's right when she talks about how it's been normalised working from home, how access to platforms like this one how access has come on hugely, with, you know, subtitling seen as the norm, and in BSL interpretation as seen as the norm, suddenly, very quickly, because it's been part of this change. And so it just shows it can be done where, you know, where there's a will. But I think you're right. And I think what you're really, the difficulty we all have, I find, is with the charity model. It's there in the newspapers, in leaflets coming through our door, it's on the TV. You know, this person's got this impairment, but they don't say that. They usually say suffering, don't they? And it's on the TV, and it's all of the, you're batting against that kind of charity model. And as you say, that also the benefits model, where people have been described as scroungers, and there's been a political agenda there. So that's really what you're batting against. But yeah, we've got a job of work to do with our union, I think, all of us, about getting that out there, that disability is really about diversity. Yeah.
And also, I guess I would add, Colleen reminded me that the model is that we're all supposed to be plucky. The Olympics, the Special Olympics, with our real kind of crystallization about all those amazing athletes who are just constantly projected as overcoming something rather than just being amazing athletes. I'm standing up for the not very plucky disabled person who likes to moan about how I feel, not be brave, not overcome it. We have that right to actually demand support and help when we want it and need it. And not be plucky all the time without being looked down on for it or not liked. There's a question come in from somebody watching. Does the NEU or the UCU have consideration around disability discrimination with the NUS? To give you a second to think, yes, we do. We usually have an NUS speaker, but the NUS have changed their model, and this year they don't have a disabled specific officer on the NUS. And because of the pandemic, we haven't had the same kind of day of action. But yes, we've often had joint protests on this day of action, and we do joint work. The demands we're pushing through Parliament, one of them, for the inclusive education of all students to be funded and so on, is an important demand that we stand for. And I know the NEU has, huge support for disabled students. So, Colleen, do you want to say something on that? And then Themesa, just ideas about how to do it?
Yeah. I mean, sure. We're sort of, as I say, my role is mainly dealing with disabled members, but I spend quite a lot of time talking about disabled young people in schools, and we know that there's loads of issues there. We know that there are a lot of children that are not in a setting, they're not in any kind of setting, and that worries us greatly. We know that those children are disproportionately affected by cuts and by the standards agenda. So, we realise that disabled people as a whole, there are issues. I'm very, very interested in, you mentioned the NUS. We know that there's issues around, access to, higher education and further education. We know that lots of things need to be in different formats, and that there's lots more work needs to be done there, and issues of access to buildings. But what's my particular moan is trainee teachers and trainee education workers in general, because lots and lots of training now goes on outside of what used to be teacher training colleges, and it now goes on in school. There's a lot of training on the job, and it's very difficult to, it's quite difficult to get into training, and then it's difficult as well to get into work as a disabled person. So I'm very, you shouldn't have to be super education worker to crack it as a disabled worker, and you're right. I'm aware that I have to keep telling myself, you do not need to be superwoman, you're good enough. But I know where that's come from. That's come from the barriers being quite high, and by people not seeing enough role models, by people not giving you an informed answer when you ask a question about, how easy will it be, or how will I navigate this thing or that thing. But no, I think that's one of the reasons why our numbers are so low, because it's a profession that's, perhaps it's the fitness to work criteria that's still in place that really doesn't help.
Yes. So I don't know if people know, but there is something in occupational health guidance around schools, in particular around teachers. Any teacher who has had a diagnosis of a mental health condition that is in some way psychosis is often removed from the job and considered not able to teach. We had that situation in Hackney at one point. There is a lot of barriers to getting in, and that also impacts the student members, the NUS members within education to work with. But we do have links. Themesa, is there anything that you'd like to say?
Yes, I just wanted to take a step back and not look at NUS and what's happening around students, but more practically, I would say, and understanding how we could organize within our spaces, because that's one of the things I said in my introduction. And because I found negotiating for appropriate reasonable adjustments quite a difficult process, and although I was a member of the union, I was very unfamiliar with how the union could support me and negotiate on my behalf to enable me to do my work through, appropriate reasonable adjustments. And it took me 4 years, 4 months for my full reasonable adjustments to be agreed. But during that time, I led a personal campaign. I decided that I was going to run a campaign with my students, my undergraduate students, to help them gain confidence to disclose their own disability or disabilities. And as a result of that initiative, I was able to develop the confidence in my students to disclose. Those people who were afraid to do so, I got them to register with the disability services and get tested if they felt they needed support. And what that saw was a huge increase in number of learning support plans we had coming through in my department for each cohort, because every time I met my students, I would say, I am Themesa Neckles. I have visual vertigo. This means that I often appear drunk. This means that I am easily distracted and my concentration levels are very low if I'm sitting, and that's why I stand to do my work all the time. And even now that I'm online teaching, I draw that to their attention to get them to understand I am a human being who has limitations, but this is not keeping me back. And I am here to support them in the best way possible. But in order to support them, I need to know and understand things about them. And doing that helped me because my specialty area is research methodology. So in my classes, I got students to begin researching their own conditions and talking about their own lived experiences and how challenging those has been navigating through the education system. As a result of that, I had 2 final year students when they got to the end of their undergraduate studies and produced their final year dissertation. They won BA dissertation prizes from our school. And I thought that was a huge achievement and a way of organizing at the lowest level, because I couldn't get my adjustments, but I found a way to help my students to manage their own adjustments and to make sense of their own lives. And one of my students would be presenting her research at our Disability History Month of activities that we've organized. So next week, Tuesday afternoon, between 1 and 2 p.m., she will be presenting her research. This has led her so far. She's now working on publishing a paper around neurodiverse conditions. All right, she's an advocate, she blogs, she is doing so much work to raise awareness about her condition, but about understanding people who live with neurodiverse conditions. And I felt like that was a success for me and a success for disabled students, because we have more students who are encouraged and confident to share, and more students who are comfortable with talking about their various conditions. So I just wanted to add that as a way of organizing. Even if we can't become reps, we can't necessarily get our adjustments in time when we need it, there are still little things we can do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer actually to the question about working with students. Sometimes the NUS is certainly not in the FE colleges. It isn't always organised. Sometimes it's not organised within the section or the department. This business of being an activist around, and I would say to everyone that's watching this, if you're a disabled activist, try and make more disabled activists around you. It's ultimately the best way to really achieve some sort of equality in the workplace. When I was at Hackney, when I started there, really nobody talked in the staff, and there were nobody pretty much that had reasonable adjustments, apart from one worker who'd been downgraded in order to get them. One of the things that I did, and this is something that both of the unions I think encourage, and on the day of action normally we would have a much bigger meeting with cross trade unions, because all the campus unions are supporting include us, but hold meetings with, organise with. One of the things I did was just called a lunchtime meeting with lunch for anybody, any worker in the college to attend. So people came from the other unions in the college, and we just talked about what was going on, and it created a different atmosphere in the workplace. 8 people put in reasonable adjustment requests, and then all those 8 people, some of whom had put them in before and given up really when it wasn't supported, then all those people really pushed through what they needed, and we started finding people getting things much quicker, much easier. So yes, work across the campus unions. We're coming towards the end, so I'm going to ask one more question. I think it's really important, and I know it's come up. It came up in an NEU meeting I did. It's come up in the Disabled Members Tea Break. And by the way, Themesa and Lucy and I have been every week, apart from this week, because we've got other webinars, since lockdown began, have been hosting a call for disabled members to join. So, you know, people can just join that network, and we've supported each other with cases, we've helped each other with individual issues, we've supported each other's mental well-being. It's really good. So do sign up to get involved. I'll get the stuff on the activist list again, and Sharon can send it out again. But last question, really. It is exhausting at the moment, just trying to do our normal jobs and get through life. This knackers me for the whole day, an hour on a webinar. Can you give any tips and thoughts to two things? Any quick thoughts about actions that we could do to get the branch more organised around disabled workers so that we have less individual stuff to do as reps in a workplace, and also finding space for ourselves and time to do the union work? Because I think Themesa highlighted something. For a lot of people in a branch, the UCU branch, being the equality rep is impossible. It's too much stuff. I think we need to break down and have people responsible for each strand anyway inside the workplace to really organise well. But any tips you've got about organising and time for yourselves in your closing thing? Thank you. Themesa, do you want to go first? Or do you want to break, and Colleen?
Yep, I think looking after yourself, self-care is really important. So giving yourself permission to stop. One thing that works for me is that at the end of every day, I tell myself, this is good enough. So on my bad days, when I could simply achieve one thing, this is my good enough. And on my really good days, when I am a superstar and I do 5 things, this is my good enough. And the other thing that I do is, even though I might have a plan and this plan doesn't go as straightforward as I would like, and it's not as successful as I thought it would have been, at the end of every week, I treat myself, because I deserve a treat for just making it through to the end of the week. And that's really important, recognizing that it's okay to not be well one day. It's okay, and give yourself permission to do that. And the other thing about organizing really is to start with what's in your hand. If you are in the classroom, you know, that you use the spaces that you are in and do the little things. The little things we do add up, you know. So that's my final point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got just 3 minutes left. So Colleen.
Well, you know, I'd agree with a lot of that. I thought Themesa's comments there were absolutely lovely. You know, when I did mention equality officer, that was a role share that I didn't do all the parts, so that was really sensible. And yeah, getting support from each other. I get support from other exec members, from other TUC colleagues, and the same would be for members in school. And you know, I'd say, if you could do little things, as you say, with your class. I mean, you know, if you can do a project so that you can educate the non-disabled members in your class. We've got a resource coming out soon about books that put disabled characters, where disabled characters are in there as a major character, and that's going to be incredibly exciting. And you know, so using good materials like that, and doing little projects so that you get everybody, because it's half the problem is people who are non-disabled and their attitudes. You know, find space for you know, embroidery, for doing love drawing. Just do things, and yet keep telling yourself you are as good as anybody else.
Thank you. I thank you, that both of you. That was really brilliant to have your contributions and your thoughts today, and much solidarity to the NEU in your fight for ending face-to-face teaching and keeping people safe. I would just finish with one thing, really, I guess. We have to break this division between individual private casework and collective action. There are ways to do both things together, that the case pursues on an individual private confidential level, and the general issues get taken up by the union as action, because unless disabled workers become more visible in the workplace, the myths and the ableist thoughts about us will continue. Things you can do very quickly to organise. You can do it next week, you can spend this week planning it, do it next week. Call a meeting of disabled workers in the workplace across the unions if you can. Think about mapping where you have people who have had the confidence to come out as disabled and sending out a survey to the branch. That's it. Solidarity. See some of you on Friday. Take care and keep organising. Thanks, guys.